Geek Out! Hi, this is a special episode with Ryan O'Sullivan and Plaid Klaus. We're here to talk about their Image Comics series, Void Trip. That's out in comic book stores everywhere on Wednesday, November 22nd. We wanted to get this out in front of New York Comic Con because they'll be promoting the series at New York Comic Con. So ipso facto, we're going to go ahead and just do that. We just put out the book review today, too, so if you missed that, give that a listen. But you know what? Let's talk to Mr. Ryan O'Sullivan and Mr. Plaid Klaus. And joining us this week, we have Ryan O'Sullivan and Plaid Klaus. They're here to talk about their Image Comics series, Void Trip. It debuts in comic book stores everywhere and on Comixology if you're more digitally inclined on Wednesday, November 22nd. Ryan, Klaus, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us, man.
Happy to be here.
So this series really feels kind of like a little Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, albeit in outer space. There's certainly that quality. But I was also getting kind of not quite Natural Born Killers, but there's more of a grit than Fear and Loathing. I mean, people die.
Yeah.
Like mild spoilers, people die in this opening issue, and I presume
Very
across
true.
the series. Yes. How did this all kind of come about? You all had worked together on Turncoat, and this is quite a bit different.
Yeah, I mean, there are some similarities to the tone, I suppose. I was talking to Klaus about this recently, how the protagonists of whatever story we come up with tend to be really useless, like as people. So that's like there are some similarities between it. But I think I was chatting to, I can't remember who it was, but I was chatting to someone earlier, and I was talking about how when you finish doing one story, like when we were coming towards the end of Turncoat, we're very proud of the book, but we started thinking about like what we would have done differently, what we learned, and also other ideas we had, because Klaus is my sounding board for stuff I come up with pretty much all the time. So, and usually we come up with an idea between us. I think is that right, Klaus? I think we just sort of came up with this as we were finishing off Turncoat, and it sort of organically sort of grew into this thing that we rapidly lost control of.
I was drawing like crazy retro futuristic 50s space stuff for whatever reason. And Ryan saw it and was like, "Oh, that's perfect," because I just wanted to write a space hobo crazy on the road and universe thing. So he came around that
originally
way.
it was called Space Hobos, but we thought we'd take hobo out of the name because I don't know.
The implications. I was explaining to Ryan, there's hobos and then there's bums. And I think we weren't sure if we were going to call it space bums or space hobos. And I was saying it's like an American thing. If the hobos used to travel, I think I got this right, travel the rails, but they would work.
Yes.
And bums were considered people that just weren't willing to work at all. It's kind of a derogatory term or whatever. And so we just tossed that whole thing aside because it's not exactly how the comic went anyway, but it's definitely a road trip novel. That was the genesis, I guess.
We had Kyle Starks on the show earlier to talk Rock Candy Mountain, and if there's anybody that knows about hobos,
he's an expert.
He is well versed.
It's actually kind of crazy. When we started talking about the story, I randomly started talking to people I saw that were like kind of hitchhiking in New York. You'll always see people with signs saying trying to get to Boston or something, need $30. And I actually met this one dude randomly and like gave him what he needed, but I sat and talked to him for like 20 minutes, and it was really interesting. He told me this whole like code of ethics that people have when they're hitchhiking and stuff, and there was all this stuff swirling in my head. I didn't use any of it, but it was fascinating that I had that kind of synchronous moment.
Well, to that point, do Gabe and Anna, the main characters of Void Trip, as they make their way to Euphoria, the hobo hippie paradise, do they have their own moral code? Because from what we see in this first issue, they are really just, any which way but loose.
I mean, they cheers, Klaus. They do and they don't. They've been called villains by one sort of reviewer person, but I wouldn't consider them villains. I just consider them sort of morally ambiguous. They do have a code. I think they're a reaction to. I mean, the premise of Void Trip is the key idea is how can you be free in a universe that sort of conspires to restrict your freedoms like innately. So I think they are a natural reaction that people on the fringe have to authority. So I think they have this sort of hobo code on the roads. So they're not going to like stab someone and steal their car, but they will try and perhaps steal some part of someone's fuel to help themselves get along, because they're all about freedom and wanting to be free, but at the same time they believe in freedom as like this essence, this thing, so they don't want to take it away from others. They're not. They are very, very selfish, but they're not selfish completely to the extent of others. Although, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about what they get up to in some of the later issues. I'm wondering if perhaps they are really selfish.
Well, yeah. As this thing kind of polished and refined itself as we were making it, these things evolve. And one thing I noticed is Gabe sort of represents the like old world establishment or society itself, and like having kind of a code and a moral ethic because you're trying to maintain a society, but they're two hobos jumping around. And I feel like he's trying to pass these things on to Anna, but she lives in such sort of a free state universe. She would never want to do anything essentially harmful or sociopathic for no reason. But she's sort of whittled down some of Gabe's sort of extremely ingrained ethics that maybe he had in a previous life. And I think now they're at a place where they have their own code, which is, I guess, kind of look out for themselves and honor the space traveling lifestyle. But they definitely bend the rules when necessary, or depending on how much fruit they've had.
The ultimate psychedelic is the barometer for their moral compass.
Yeah, I like that.
Say. Yeah.
I might steal that and put it in issue 5. Cheers, man.
That's a freebie.
That's just a thank you for coming on the internet.
Okay.
To that point, what do you think it is that keep Gabe and Anna together? Because there are quite a few instances in this debut where Gabe is just like, you can't do. Why are you doing this? Like, what is it that are we going to see how they originally linked up? What keeps them? What's that friction that keeps them together?
Yeah, I think it's codependency completely. We just went into how selfish they are, and I think they can only really trust each other because the universe has just treated them badly over and over and over again to the point where they rely on each other. And Gabe, we do get into in some of the latter issues about like their history and how they found each other. And Gabe likes to think of himself as Anna's sort of father figure or mentor, but Anna absolutely doesn't see him that way. And I think that's the dynamic that's kind of fun. Like he's trying to be a mentor, and I think she ultimately just becomes his mentor just because she's so obsessed with freedom at no cost. Like she will refuse to sort of kowtow to the system. Whereas Gabe, he's a little bit more long in the tooth. He understands that you find freedom in the gaps that society lets you. Whereas she's like, nah, that's not freedom at all. So, yeah. Also went off topic a bit then, but I think I got...
No. I mean, Anna's good for Gabe. I mean, I had a bipolar friend growing up, and I was raised by like a pretty strict parent household, and I kind of loved the chaos, just letting a little bit of it in, not being the form of chaos, because like that can get a little crazy and scary in itself because you're leading the way, but to be a passenger on that. So I think Gabe, in some ways, enjoys it, but does try to rein it in because he can't help but act like a parent when he has so many more years on someone. But
I think to an extent he does sort of live vicariously through her as well. Like she does stuff that he no longer can do.
Yep.
So
kind of reminds him who he once was or why he chose the lifestyle he did.
Like he sort of so I can.
No, by all means. I was just going to grandstand a little more.
It's all good, man. I like it. But yeah, I mean he's sort of. I mean, I've always liked in any sort of space story, there's always the mentor, and the hero learns from the mentor, and then they blah blah blah. But I quite like the idea of Gabe being a failed mentor. That's got the kind of the point of the story is that Anna is refusing to allow the universe to break her, even though it is trying really hard to do so, and even her mentor was trying to break her. He's trying to break her down and make her like him. So.
Yep.
Like you were saying, they fill gaps.
Yeah, exactly. So I think she's... Yeah, I suppose so.
Now,
So you got me, my head in the clouds right now.
Now, Ryan, this isn't your first time kind of doing the sci-fi rodeo. You had done things like Warhammer 40K and all that. Obviously,
Yes.
This is quite a bit different than orcs with machine guns, unless we get orcs with machine guns, which would still be awesome, but...
No spoilers.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no orcs with machine guns or space marines or anything like that.
Imperial Guard next time. The sequel will have all that.
I'll just casually like infringe on all these copyrights.
Yeah, Games Workshop's just like, wait a minute.
But I thought I could use these now. No, that's not how this works.
So how is it kind of shifting tonally? Because, I mean, again, there are consequences to the story. Again, people die. But this definitely has more, like its characters, has more of a free spirit, and certainly kind of leans into that kind of psychedelic road trip that I suppose there's, the two I can think of would be Fear and Loathing and Apocalypse Now. They do quite a bit of drugs.
Yeah. Yes.
Unless they're what's his name? The guy that gets like speared. Spoilers for like a 30-year-old, 40-year-old film. But what made you kind of want to shift tonally into this?
I mean, the easy answer would be to say that, the sort of the sci-fi stuff that I've done for Warhammer, or the sort of other comics I've done, like The Evil Within, that are really serious in tone and written for a really specific audience. The easy thing would be to say, I just want to do something funny and something that was I wasn't after an audience, because when you do license work, you're writing for an audience, you're writing for fans. Whereas with create your own stuff like Turncoat or Void Trip, that's more you're not even writing for anyone, you're writing for yourself in a way. You're writing the book that you wish was on the shelf. So I mean, I think that's what the reason. Yeah, I think that's the way I went behind it. I mean, the licensed comic work, like the Warhammer stuff, having it have such a serious tone did help teach me discipline, because the risk with doing something like Void Trip, with it being so psychedelic, is that you can go completely off the rails and just be like, whoa, groovy, man, look at all the fun. And you can do like amazing things with the visuals and make it a really formalistic comic, But if you go too far with the sort of the crazy, then you miss out on, story arcs or emotional moments or, sort of existential dread. And so doing something in an established sci-fi universe, which has all those things already figured out by other writers who'd come before me, gave me a sort of an understanding and a foundation of what sort of things I need to replicate in Void Trip. I mean, there's not a direct parallel really at all between the Warhammer comics and Void Trip, but it definitely gave me a lot of discipline to avoid me going too far off the rails when I was scripting it. Although,
yeah, I mean, for a drug comic, it's relatively grounded in reality. Like, the drugs sort of act as more of a catalyst for problems that you didn't have to see the characters react and get out of. Surprisingly, I mean, for a psychedelic comic, like I said, it's pretty grounded. But it's funny because most every comic I've done on my own before I started working with Ryan involves psychedelics. So this for me was like reverse of a departure. It was like getting back to a space I was familiar with. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of fun that way. But also, I think, in a story that's in the entire universe, drugs aren't necessarily the craziest thing. Space itself is pretty gnarly. So yeah, again, I think when Ryan first started, the fruit was the name of it, and it was supposed to be sort of like a secondary thing. It was only there as like an element that sort of flavored the fact that it's this on the road story, and that's like kind of an element of that time. I could be wrong, but I think isn't that right, Ryan, when you first started tapping into it? And also it's just kind of fun.
Yeah, because the idea of doing a sort of a road trip story through space that involved drugs but didn't actually have to involve any of the bad side of drugs. So we called it fruit and made it just like psychedelic fruit that makes people, that can talk to people. So the idea there being that you just get the fun bits of drugs without having to worry about sort of moral implications of people ruining their lives with it or all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, no one's shooting up fruit.
No one's shooting up, that we know of. Like maybe off Canada, there's this entire planet of people shooting up fruit, or maybe fruit shooting up humans. If you go full on like
that would be amazing.
It's Attack
and
of
one
the
thing we
Killer
had
Tomatoes.
cut was a planet full of tree people who were just like ants, but they had, and it goes really well. And the space typos arrive on this planet, they get on really well with them, and then they go to an art gallery, and they just see like the walls are just covered in paintings that have been painted on human flesh, but and then they just sort of get out of there. So sort of these weird cultures that we sort of got rid of as the story's gone on, not used, are sort of in the back of my mind. But no, fruit played a huge part of it. And getting back to the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, that was a huge influence. But because we're not used, the one thing about Fear and Loathing that I quite like is you have all these crazy antics that Hunter S. Thompson gets up to, contrasted with the dark, biting humour in the narration of the story. Now, Void Trip doesn't have any narration, so one of the problems I had when I was coming up with the early scripts, it's just pure dialogue, was that the characters felt like, if you read a comic where you feel like the author thinks their characters are more charming than they are, that's the vibe I got. So I had to sort of tone down the craziness, because if the characters are just being crazy and you've not got any narration to counterbalance it, you're just gonna, the story is going to look like it's in love with itself. So that's why, from a sort of, I don't know, story making point of view, it had to be a little bit more grounded. But with that said, they do go completely off the rails as well. They do.
In that way, you've also created an antagonist, kind of a Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid-esque man with a straw hat figure. Was that to kind of lend a greater sense of urgency to the story?
Oh yeah, completely. And he was also, because obviously Anna and Gay were very much like, hey dude, hey man, like dude, man. I didn't want, and that's like a specific Beat Generation 1960s countercultural way of looking at, or way of talking to each other. But the problem is that sounds very similar to what's called millennial voice in comics. Where characters sound like, everyone sounds like Joss Whedon characters, right? So to counterbalance that and to make the comic not sound like every other comic out there, we wanted this sort of Old Testament fire and brimstone dude who was sort of straight out of a Cormac McCarthy novel, who's all about sort of chasing these last two humans. And we never say who he is. Even in the last issue, which we're still sort of figuring out, we've not said exactly who he is. He's more of a force of nature. And with comics giving the reader so much, the less imagination is required reading a comic than a novel, because you've got art there, right? Mm-hmm. So we wanted to sort of give readers something they have to guess at and try and figure out for themselves, and there not be any right or wrong answer as to who this dude that's chasing them through space actually is. And plus it let us play with Gnosticism a lot, didn't it? I think that was one of the things that really
and it definitely gives the reader it gives the reader like an unexpected twist. I'm not going to spoil, but he turns out to be like, there's definitely a trick at the end, which is nice. I want to talk about it, but I can't yet.
We'll get you guys for the trade here.
There you go.
Sneaky.
The kind of a LaForge-esque character.
Yeah, like it was like and I kind of had like a Rom Space Knight thing when I first saw him, and I was like, "Fuck yeah!" Evil Rom Space Knight with an assault rifle on his back.
He definitely has a good voice, and he's a fun character to draw.
Yeah.
So sort of.
I
love the idea that there's a mask, which obviously is like completely separating any emotions he may have from the reader. Gives a level of spooky.
Sure. Kind of to that point, in terms of the art and the visual stuff, how is it? I mean, Turncoat was the world's worst hitman. With Void Trip, you're all of imagination's your only limit in crafting these worlds. How has it been kind of developing visually? You had mentioned the cut planet of tree people. But how has it been like developing each of these very unique and diverse settings?
I mean, for me, it's wonderful. I love having just free range, like things that, you want to keep it familiar to the reader as far as it can't be so abstract that they don't recognize what things are. But I kept it in sort of this retro futuristic vein, sort of at first. And it allows things to be recognizable. And then each world can kind of have its own horde of characters. And one of my favorite things to do is to just tell a little story in my head as I'm designing a character, of like the species and whatnot, and just catalog that for myself. And then as they travel around, you might see the same species, which the reader will never know the backstory. But since I have it, I feel like when you give intention like that, it sort of translates. And one of the ways I talk about it is, you might see a foreign language and not be able to read it, but you can see there's an intention behind the language. And that kind of makes the reader give pause to like want to know more about each one of those cultures and whatnot. So for me, it was a lot of fun.
And then what's your collaborative process kind of like? Do you kind of run like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if there was a planet where, like X happened? Or, obviously this isn't the first project you've worked together on. So, yeah. Is it kind of, are there sequences that are straight up Marvel style? Or, is there, how much create or collaboration is there?
I think when we sort of were putting together the first few issues, it was a lot of me sending Klaus the outlines. Okay, this is what I want to happen in the issue, and he'd look at it and be like, "Well, what do you think about this?" Or it seems like this character's motivation doesn't make sense there. Or he'll say, "Well, have you thought about, one big part of hobo culture is X. Have you thought about putting that in there?" So I mean, he's sort of my editor a bit at the early stages, so that helped us figure out collaboratively how to do this thing.
Yeah, and it was fun. Like as we got more into it, and we understood the emotions of the scenes and how it was building. Doing each scene on a different planet allowed me to kind of adapt the environment to the mood. So for like a sadder scene, and I think Ryan and I talked about this stuff all the time, back and forth. We did like an ice world because it was more appropriate for what the reader was going through. So that was nice to be able to utilize that as a narrative device.
Yeah, I think the opening of issue 1, when they're stealing fuel from the big fuel truck, that was Klaus's idea, because we'd done it originally like just them on the road getting stopped by cops, and he's like, "No, they're like drifters, man. They need to steal fuel. That needs to be in there." So okay, that could be the first thing they do.
Yeah, and the desert scene helps show that they're like, I mean, there's nothing worse than being stranded in the desert, or like a desert in space is even more. Like, can you imagine? So.
Nice. Now, the Void Trip is being solicited as a miniseries. What made you guys want to kind of take it from that angle? Are there future plans? Was there originally plans to make it ongoing?
I think because Turncoat had been 6 chapters, we wanted to do something that was of a similar length, and we had sort of the scope of the story called for it. Like when we came up with the idea, it was very much a character study in Anna and Gabe, and that's a hard thing to drag out or do for longer than 12 issues. But I think we just wanted to have one book together that was completely us. Turncoat I'm still very proud of it. I'm sure Klaus is, but we wanted to move on to something that was to learn our lessons, move on to the next thing, and make that solid. And the scope of the story just wasn't beyond 5 issues. I mean, if it turns out after we've written it, we come up with like a really dope idea for a spin-off or a sequel or something, then maybe. But I always hate when TV shows go on too long, so I don't want to be like the comics equivalent of that. I think once you've done something, you should sort of just be happy with it and move on to the next.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing Ryan and I are totally in agreement on. And we actually talked about, continuing to work on other things. I've always loved movies because of the conclusion of the thing. Like serialized comics for me was always too much, because if you don't jump in right away, it just feels like you're drowning in narrative to catch up to, and you're so far behind. But I like the idea now with, like, especially TV being more popular, maybe doing a longer concluded series, like maybe, instead of doing just 5-6 issues, maybe we do like 12 or something a little more extended. But I love the idea that there's an intention to close it at some point, and it's a self-contained story. It's not something that's just, as long as it's selling well, we'll just keep running with it. So.
What would you say are some of the across this 5 issues then are going to be some of the bigger themes? Is it kind of just self-discovery, self-worth?
I think it's the main theme of it is how can you be free in a universe that doesn't let you be free. I think there's a scene in issue 1 where Anna goes on about how big companies price gating fuel means that anyone with a certain amount of income can only travel a certain amount of distance. So you literally have physical limitations on how you can travel, so your agency is limited. It's just always all the way through. It's just constantly looking at different ways people can be free, different concepts of what freedom is, whether we can have it at all. The key theme is like, what does freedom entail? So they go to all these different planets, and there's different sort of societies that operate in different ways. But primarily, it's Anna. Without spoiling too much, is Anna coming to the realization that you can't really be free in this universe, and then the sort of consequence of what her sort of response to that is. And I think that's something that every single human being, sort of on a sort of existential level, comes to terms with in their life. They realize that the life isn't going the way they want, or they realize that they don't have the freedoms they want, they don't do what they want. So how do they respond? And it does get very, very dark and very, very pessimistic. And that's one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to call this a comedy. We've got we've got there's a lot of humor in it, but we contrast it quite heavily with some really sort of dark, sort of existential themes, and I think that's one thing that makes Klaus's art so perfect for it, in that it can be very cartoony in its style and very beautiful as well, but it also has a lot of heavy black inks too, so it's perfect for the style of dark comedy, would you call it, that we do? Yeah, why not?
For sure.
I mean, ultimately the story is probably what you would call a tragedy if you're doing it by like Shakespeare categorizations, but I feel like I'm going to give too much away if I keep talking, so I'm going to stop.
But it definitely digs into like those Gnostic themes of, Anna slowly starts to think, is this place more of a trap than an actual paradise? Which I think is a common thing people do come to the conclusion of if they get strung out long enough, on a psychedelic bender. Eventually they come to the realization that maybe you can't escape the fact that there's always a come down from the euphoria. And that's a big theme kind of woven throughout. That and because Anna represents youth and vitality and like a lack of experience with the thing, Gabe is kind of more the void and Anna's more the trip, is how I like to think about it. But Gabe's been through it, and he's more burnt out on life, and he realizes that it's not a happy paradise. And I think that's one of the things you go through from childhood to adulthood. And so we're seeing Anna in this condensed story experience that existential dread of like, oh, it's not all sunshine and rainbows forever. There's real things to life, and that's constantly what she's running from.
Yeah. Again, this is definitely a book that has real consequences. Your description kind of reminds me of the Nexus from Star Trek Generations, where at the end of it, Kirk gets everything he wants in the Nexus, but as he's chilling with Captain Picard, he makes that realization that none of it's real. Like, paradise is lost for him.
Yeah, Star Trek is amazing when it comes. They have a lot of Gnostic episodes. They go deep into it.
Yeah, especially like Next Gen. Well, something we ask everybody that comes on the show, guys. What are you guys currently geeking out over?
I'm currently geeking out over XCOM 2, the video game. Oh, nice. I'm absolutely loving playing it. I mean, I'm a pretty big gamer because I do a bunch of comics based on video games, but this one there's no comic, it's just pure fun. And with this sort of the lead into the Void Chip release from Image in November, it's been a bit stressful. First time doing this sort of stuff, getting all my ducks in order, getting everything figured out. So being able to sort of play a video game where I worry about whether my soldiers are going to live, and then suddenly that, like, what guns they have and all that sort of stuff, that taking over the stressful side of comics was very much welcome. But yeah, it's awesome. And
that's such a brutally difficult game too.
It is, man. I mean, I do sort of save scum a little bit. Like, if I lose my favourite soldier, I'll sort of reload. But other than him, everyone else is fair game.
Yeah, I guess
I just think it's like time travel or something. Like, I'll just make a bit of a bullshit story reason why I can do it. Sorry, Kaz.
Oh no, it's okay. My life's been consumed with the fact that I've got a baby, or my wife's got a baby coming. So I'm seeing life in a whole new way, and I'm starting to I'm actually getting excited about starting to rewatch or watch old kid movies I haven't seen, because I've been putting them off forever, and I was always into that stuff as a kid, and you get too old to watch them. But as far as content out there, I don't know, man. I've been consumed by this project, so I've just been focusing on it. The only thing I did pick up Doom Patrol, which I thought was going an interesting way, and I'm kind of curious to see where it's going to go in the second volume.
When you're working, David Brothers and I always have this conversation, like what artists do in the background. Do you have to work in silence? Do you listen to music? Do you have something on TV?
I a lot of times I listen to podcasts because it's like having someone in the room, and it's a way of having a conversation, or that part of the conversation where you're actively thinking without having to actively respond. So you have, which I love dialogue, I love conversing, and so it's like I get to have that while I'm also working. It shuts off that right side of my brain where I'm more in the imaginative realm of the world, and I'm not actively thinking about it. I have to listen to music when I'm breaking scripts down because I do have to use that other side of the brain a little more. But yeah, no, I mean, I listen to music a lot too, but podcasts mainly.
Right on, man.
If you were curious.
I'll compare notes with David when I see him at New York Comic Con.
But actually, it's interesting. Like if I'm listening to music for a project, like for this one, I made a whole playlist of like 70s. I call it Dusty Road tunes to get into that vibe and atmosphere. And then I put another playlist of psychedelic rock bands from the 70s, which I learned a whole new like realm of music I didn't know existed, from like kind of fringy prog rock to this sort of weird psychedelic harder rock that was coming out of that time period, and so that was a lot of fun. And recently I haven't pitched this to Ryan yet, but I've been thinking about trying to do something involving like more hip hop, rap themed stuff, so whatnot. So I think if I do listen to music, it has to fit the mood.
Oh, I guess you heard it here first, Ryan.
Yeah, that sounds cool. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, anything you guys want to, pitch while, we got you on?
We'll be at New York Comic Con next week, sort of doing a signing with a preview of Void Trip issue 1. So if you or anyone listening is in the area, come along and say hey. It's on the Thursday at I think 5 p.m. I think at the Image booth. Yeah, I mean that's me plugged out.
Right on.
I don't have anything to pitch other than you can always join my cult if you want, but nothing other than that. I'm just kidding.
I mean, it's just me and Klaus right now, but we are looking for members.
It's a two-man show.
I mean, that's bring the sign-up sheet to New York.
Yeah, for anyone listening, you heard
There
it.
you go.
Signing/cult recruitment. That'll be fine, I'm sure.
You do present a good. Now that I'm thinking about it, Klaus, you do present a good point, because there are movies that we have revisited here, just because we got time. Like Hook doesn't age well. Like I loved Hook as a kid, but as an adult, it maybe doesn't. It would be interesting to see that through the eyes of a child and see if that holds up.
It's always fun to see a next generation observing the stuff that you grew up on and just being clueless, especially when you think about weird items that no longer exist that were so crucial to your world back then, like VHS players and all that stuff. That's the thing to me that's starting to sink in is like time's passing and like these objects that slowly morph into different objects and the complexity of time molding things, and it's all fascinating.
Well, again, that first issue of Void Trip is out in comic book stores everywhere on Wednesday, November 22nd, and you can catch Ryan and Klaus at New York Comic Con at the Image booth, and you might be able to catch me there too. I guess the week this thing posts. Yeah. So check it out if you're in the greater New York City area. Ryan, Klaus, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah,
thanks for having us, man.
This has been another Geek Out production. If you enjoyed what you heard, hey, we've got a special episode every Friday. Of course, there's the usual catching up show every Wednesday, and you get book club episodes just about every Tuesday these days. Thanks for listening.